Hello and welcome to the Empowered Curiosity podcast. You all, if you've been around for any amount of time, you've probably heard Christina Cecconi on the podcast with me. She is one of my closest friends and fellow Five Elements nerd. And last year we did a whole series on the five elements and how they show up in the spirit. And this year we are doing another series specifically about how the five elements show up in your business. So if you're curious about the earth element, which we're going to get into this afternoon, if you're curious about the earth element at all, go check out episode 57, and that would have been from last year's series. But I'm super excited to get into this conversation with you, Christina.
Yay!
Very official. Yeah!
Let's do it.
Yeah. I feel like a little bit of like separation anxiety from you because we've spent so much time together this summer, and the last episode we got to record was actually in person. So
it's such a treat to be in the same room.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I'm totally missing having you right next to me. Yeah, but this is going to be good too.
We'll do what we can and then probably get together again at some point. So
yeah, I get to see you actually next week.
Yeah.
So life will go on. We'll be okay. I think we'll manage.
Yeah. And we'll just keep bringing your listeners along no matter where we are, which is pretty awesome in the way that you've set up your business. So I love it.
Yeah. We've had a chance to meet in Nevada and California, and now I'll be heading up to Vancouver to see you. So,
which was perfect for the summer episode because it was really quite hot and the element of fire was on point. That was a really nice place to talk about that. And now this is a funny time of year because it's the fifth season. It's a transitional season, so if anyone has been following along, probably you'll get a bit of a picture or have come across the five elements that are referred to in the Taoist medicine that we practice, and just a way of looking at nature and the natural flow and changes and shifts of energy in the universe throughout our bodies, throughout the universe, throughout different times of the day, and then bringing it in this series into how your business also experiences different phases of growth and change and shifting. And because I think that's one of the things that we've lost a lot in the modern world is this, we have taken on this idea, I think, because we can control lights and temperature that we just don't connect to those phases as much anymore. And we expect that ourselves and our business are going to be the same day in, day out, year in, year out. And I think that there's not enough building in this recognition that nature is phasic and we are not separate from that. And so this has been a really interesting series to dive into, because this affects our whole lives. And of course, your business is an extension of your life and your purpose. And so it's been really fun to bring it into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I started thinking about my business from this idea of cycles and aligning with the elements and aligning with the energetics of the elements and recognizing that my business does go through cycles. It pulled me out of this thinking that I was taught, and I don't know, I imagine that a lot of people feel this way of we always have to be in a state of growth. We always have to be in a state of production, which is a very wood element phase to be in, and being a more woody type personality, I thrived in that kind of world, but also it burnt me out. So actually looking at my business, and I've been an entrepreneur since, 12 years now. So however long ago that was. But, when I started Empowered Curiosity, I was like, you know what? All of my other businesses burnt me out, and I love this idea so much that I feel like it is worth looking at it from a more sustainable model. And actually, the more that empowered curiosity has grown, I've started looking at it from a more regenerative space. And producer Andre and I were just nerding out about this the other day, so it feels like super fresh in my mind. So I kind of want to share with you. But when we look at our businesses from a profit first perspective, and that's sort of like the intentionality of our business, then a lot of the actions that come afterwards make perfect sense. And so this is why we have conventional agricultural practices where it's like monoculture, and we don't let the earth rest, and we, focus on just planting as many things into the ground as possible, and then, pulling all the nutrition out of the soil and then replenishing that with chemical fertilizers, because that's faster than actually allowing composting to happen. And so, if we start with this idea of my business is meant to generate as much money as possible in a shorter period of time, then all these actions make sense, right? Whereas when you start thinking about your business as being a vehicle to express your purpose, and of course we want you to profit, but the profit ends up being a byproduct of this experience that you are having as a human being, as an entrepreneur, then you end up with very, very different actions. And so, there's a new, I want to put new in quotation, like heavy, boldened quotation marks. But there's this new like phase of agriculture that's coming into fashion nowadays called regenerative agriculture. And the reason why I want to put it into like bold quotation marks is because it's really going back to practices that are more traditional, that indigenous people have been doing for generations and generations. And so it's really not anything new. We just put a fancy new term on it because the West loves
we're
doing
remembering
that.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. But in regenerative agriculture, the focus is on the soil. The focus is on how do we cultivate the healthiest soil possible with like beautiful microbes and lovely bugs and critters crawling through it, and just it's full of life. And then when you put a seed into the ground, it is going to thrive in this because it's the environment is set up for it. And then different pollinators come into the picture, and also like lots of other different kind of critters come into the picture. And so it becomes this space where there's an ecosystem, there's an environment, there's a community. And as the active participant, as a farmer in that community, it's, yes, you may turn this into a business, but ultimately the fruit that comes out of that garden is more nutritious. It is healthier for the environment. It's healthier for, our culture. And so I think that's how I want to start shifting thinking about my own business, is if I cultivate a safe space for my community, which happens to be spiritual entrepreneurs, then the value is in the ecosystem. The value is in the community. It's in the discussions that we're having. And, I put out offers every once in a while, and some people may end up buying, some people may not. That's totally okay. But I still want people to feel like they are interacting with our material in a way that's valuable for them, whether they, invest money or not. And to me, like, that's the difference between how I want to start seeing and teaching other spiritual entrepreneurs to approach their work, is let's pull the shift away from just, 10K months in 6 weeks, and, more about, can we cultivate safe spaces in areas that have not historically felt safe. And so I went on a bit of a tangent there, but I feel like
that's great, because what I hear is a great conversation around a term that gets way overused and I think diluted a bit, but you just were describing true, I think, sustainability is what came to mind. And that's why I love these elemental conversations, this looking to nature as a check-in on how, like, basically a reality check on things, how things actually work. The model is there. We just have to remember that we're part of it. But what you just described with the nutrition of the soil, that is compared to, say, like monocropping or things like that, that is a sustainable model. And when you think about that in the design of your life, in the design of your business, you also need to be sustainable. And the only example I can think of in nature where it's growth for growth's sake without any checkpoints or change basically is what we call cancer, where it's this unchecked growth and it ends up not being sustainable and not helpful. And so, the idea is that we put on our lives and on our business that it's, if you're just focusing on one phase of the business cycle, of your life cycle, then it's going to be hard to sustain over time and something will go. And so, and also it's a good model like that regenerative farming, it's a model that shows, yes, just because you're doing it a different way and you're not solely focused on profit doesn't mean that you're trading this yield of results. You will actually yield more nutrients, more profit, more, it'll be in a way that is actually sustainable. And that's going to be a variety that's going to look very different because everybody's very different in what their values are, what they need, what they want. And so there's not this one magic number. So that could look like one set of numbers for somebody and a lifestyle for somebody else. But in the end, this is going to nourish you. We're in the earth season of nourishment, and this is going to sustain you, resource you, so that those cycles will keep going for many, many, many productive years, and get all the nourishment and phases of rest and yield abundance that we wanted them to.
Yeah. I think that you bring a special draw into that idea of nourishment because, even if you compare these two agricultural models, the regeneratively grown tomato is going to be a lot more nutritious than a tomato that's grown in a hothouse with soil that's been depleted of all of its nutrition. And so, if you sort of apply that analogy and that sort of structure to your business, your offers are going to be more nourishing to your people rather than being full of water and fluff, and it'll be tastier and it'll just be a much more robust product. Because you've taken so much time to tend to the soil and to tend to the earth. And this is where I also feel like a lot of people are led astray by promises of, business programs that are going to, elevate them to whatever sort of external factors of success look like. Is, in my experience, this kind of business, it will nourish you, but nobody ever talks about how slow that growth is, and I'm actually grateful for the slowness of growth with Empowered Curiosity because it's allowed me to pivot and shift and change and make sure that at every pivot, which is a very earth topic, with every pivot, it's given me a chance to really go back to my values. Does this align? Does this continue to align as the business is growing and changing? Whereas if we had, sort of skyrocketed it immediately, I don't know that I would have been able to keep up with those pivots in a way that was regulating to my nervous system. And therefore, I wouldn't be doing my best work for my clients if I'm feeling dysregulated.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned slow because that struck me as how subjective that that timeline is, because from my point of view, I'm like, oh, Kat's just rocketed through so many of these phases from the outside. We all work at our own pace, and you also had some foundations in place before that people might not have seen were there. So from the outside, it could look that like, oh gosh, how come they were able to do this in X amount of time? I should do that too. And this is where we have to start, I think, cultivating our own wisdom to, and where these phases can be helpful. What phase am I in? Because if I'm going for the, my marketing plans and I'm doing this phase, but I have skipped over the check-in with my heart to know even what I want out of life, what my values are, you're going to build on, you've skipped the planting season. You're trying to harvest tomatoes and you haven't planted any tomatoes. Like these things get, and then we feel bad about it. Then we're like, what's wrong with me? How come that didn't work?
I think that with all of these sort of like esoteric 5 elements type of conversations, it's always really wonderful when we can bring it back to yin yang theory. So I always love just sitting back and listening to you just talk about yin yang all day long. So I'll let you take over that part. Yeah,
well, we're talking about your personal power and the earth being the center, and the this is the 5th season. This late summer is, you've got spring, summer, fall, winter that we're all fairly familiar with. And then there's this 5th season, this 5th element of earth, which if you imagine a wheel, it's like the hub in the middle of the wheel, and everything branches off of this, and it keeps everything revolves around this center, which you can think of also your personal center of power. And in yin yang, this is a transition point between spring and summer, and the upper yang sort of elements, the outward projecting potential, and the formless things like, your Tao, the passion, these seeds that we could plant that carry possibility, that can take on form. And the earth is where this rotates down into the yin aspects, which are the formed and the material. So now these ideas that we have become tangible, but they become concrete, like a stem cell that has the potential to be anything, but this time it's an eye and this time it's a finger. So this 5th element, this is where we start to transition from idea to material form. And this has to come from and be rooted in also your personal power, because if we're always outward looking or not reconnecting with ourselves, then it becomes very hard to take these ideas and get them into material form. Like a lot of people might relate to being, I always have so many ideas, but I can't make anything happen. Or always being maybe the opposite, where I'm getting all these practical things done, but I'm exhausted because I feel so disconnected from these heavenly insights, these callings of your heart. Yeah. And the earth is where these two things, the yin and the yang, really get to mix and integrate. And basically, you think of the earth mother as an archetype, kind of birth these ideas into the world, and which is what your business is. This is your opportunity to create form and things in your personal way that only you have mixed the ingredients and have the capability to do. Your style, which is one of the wonderful aspects of nature, is its creative force and all the different forms that we get to take on. So yeah, this is where I see the pivot point, and it is the center of the yin and the yang and the coming together.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that it's worth noting that because it is the pivot season, we think of it as the late summer season, but also in the Taoist tradition, sometimes they insert that earth element in between each point of transition between the seasons. And so like between spring and summer, and between summer and fall, and, between all those different points. And having been an acupuncturist for many years, and I'm not sure if you have similar experiences, but people struggle with these seasonal changes. It's when they get sick, it's when sleep goes off, it's when digestion goes off. And I'm actually experiencing this in the last week or two because for whatever reason, I had like a string of several nights of insomnia, which is sort of my weak point. I had horrible digestive stuff last week. And, I'm actually, now that I've been doing this work and been listening more to my body, I'm actually grateful for these messages from my body because it's giving me a chance to really look into, okay, so what are these practical things that have gone out of balance in my life where it's showing up in these like really core things that I hold pretty sacred. I hold my sleep very sacred. I hold my digestion to be really sacred. And when I really sat down and looked at what my habits were like, there was some room for improvement. It was my body's way of being like, hey, we're in the middle of a transition. We're in the state of pivoting and you're not taking care of your body in the ways that you need to be taking care of your body. And so one of the silly things that had gone off track is I traveled from California to Washington. Beautiful weather in California, like 75 almost every day. And now that we've landed here in Washington, it's been like, high 80s all the way up into like the high 90s. And I'm just not drinking enough water. Like that was like a silly thing that had gone off track for me. And, when water goes out, then pretty much everything else goes out. And so, it's a reminder that as you are pivoting, as you're transitioning, to look at these core center values, but also like just basic habits that might go out. And particularly if you're in the midst of a transition in your life or in your business, I just want to like shoot a little reminder here. Maybe your body might be speaking up and saying, hey, like, help me out a little bit here. Help me support you.
Yes. And I love that you remind us to come back into our body in your work. And which is another way I think we've disconnected from our natural ourselves as we get a lot into our heads and forget to drop down all the way down into our physical form as well. And earth is so practical. This is the time for foundations of going over the basics. How are you supposed to have energy to come up with business plans and execute all the things you need to do if you're not sleeping enough, if you haven't fed yourself? And so we get real reminders. I think this comes up seasonal for a lot of people at this time of year of this is a chance to check in. Notice I didn't say this is a chance to judge ourselves harshly and, reprimand ourselves for not being better. This is a chance to recheck in. Hey, has anything gone out of balance and I'm not being resourced and nourished as well as I can? And what is that? Because Earth season is also a very thoughtful, it's when our mind processes, or if it's in balance, are supposed to be really on board. It's the back to school time. It's the scholarly time where you make your plans and reorganize things. And so it's a great time to come back to those basics, those foundations. Am I getting enough sleep? Do I need to adjust things? What are these basic things that nourish and support me? And is there any adjustments that I need to come back to? Because we're also, we're always changing. We're coming up to fall pretty soon, which is after doing these kind of assessments, we're going to have a pretty good idea of what we need to get rid of and let go of that isn't so helpful anymore. But this is the time where we prepare for that. Like, oh, what do I need? And then what do I not need?
Yeah.
And on transitions too, we were talking earlier how they can come into any time. So anytime your business or your life is in a transition, you're going to use a little bit of that earth element, and how wonderful that it is earth, which means it's very grounding. So again, dropping into your physical body, getting cues from your body. Where is what I'm feeling showing up? How do I feel this? What do I need? Am I getting what I need? Do I need to ask for something else? is this a time to work on blockages that I might have around receiving money, receiving help, receiving help from myself, putting my personal power, coming from my personal power, because this is one of the great ways that we say very earthy archetypes get depleted. You can think of the martyr, you can think of the overgiver, and a lot of, I think, entrepreneurs in giving professions tend to be very outward focused. How can I do for you? How can I do for you? And we always, if that's something that you trend into, always need to come back to, I can't do for you until I do for myself. And you will just, we need to constantly come back to this, what I'm offering needs to come from me and sustain me. How I sustain me is how I have something creative to offer you. And if it's not coming from that place, you're going to have to borrow resources from other things and it'll be unsustainable. And at some point you will be in deep exhaustion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as you were speaking, I kept returning to this word that you said, which was nourishment. And to me, nourishment is being able to receive, digest, and integrate. And, you know, that's such a hard thing. Even just that first step of it is really hard for so many of us. I was just telling you that in this last round of BAM, we just finished up our graduation ceremony. And so we end on the earth element. And, you know,
awesome,
that's which is by design.
Awesome. Transition to, personal power. There you go.
Exactly.
Awesome. Integrate.
Yeah. Because I think that so many people struggle with this aspect of earth, which is to receive. And you can, you know, put it in all sorts of different contexts, but you know, with BAM, it's been really lovely because we've had a chance to really see each other grow over 9 months. And that seeing and witnessing, and one of the last rituals that we do together is that we all sit in a virtual circle and we share the things that we see about each person. And so the work of each person is to sit and receive these words.
Awkward.
And it's hard for people. It really is.
Like so lovely. And that's something that we've learned to be very challenged by.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, I mean, how many times has somebody said something nice to you and then you start racking your brain and you start thinking, oh, I need to somehow diminish that, or tell them, you know, I didn't put that much effort into it, or now I need to give them a compliment that is, you know, of equal value, instead of just saying thank you and I receive, you know. And so it can start as as simple as something, as a practice around, I don't know, when I started doing this work around earth, I would very awkwardly tell people when they would tell me compliments, you know, I'm having a hard time receiving and I'm practicing receiving. So I'm going to say thank you. And please know that I am truly, truly grateful. And I'm not going to say anything beyond that because I'm working on receiving.
How wonderful as a practice, and how liberating for everyone to hear that from, you know, someone else, if it's something you're struggling with. And people were so honest, like, this is something I'm working on, and not having to pretend to be the master of all. Yeah. I think we need to do more things like that in our lives. That's so nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it can go into, you know, being able to receive money for your work. For me, the big challenge this year has been around receiving help. You know, Empowered Curiosity has now grown to a place where I have 3 employees. And with that comes a lot of help. And I have 3 people who are wholehearted and wonderful and just amazing humans who want to help. And because this business has been something that I've run by myself for so long, it's been really hard to practice actually allowing that help in, even though logically I know, this is going to be better for the business, and, this is going to help us serve more people, and all of the logical things. And it's still a hard practice. And so, I think because these patterns start returning to us, you might have struggled with receiving compliments in the beginning, and then, struggled with receiving money. And it's like, if we can get to the root of these struggles, which really comes down to you being able to receive in an open and authentic and aligned way, instead of finding your value in giving all the time, whether that's in material goods or services, then, a lot of these things shift on the deep root tectonic levels. And that's kind of the work that I want to inspire in people. Let's just get down to the nitty gritty of it, and really integrate on that deep level.
The other piece to receiving, I also kept thinking about digestibility, which is it's the earth as an element is also tied in the 5-element theory to digestion on our digestive organs. And so when we do some of these practices, this is a good time to start thinking for the fall where you might need to pare down, because these things that come at us, we can't just, pour in and keep pouring and overflow. We need to digest and integrate these things. This is, again, if you think between the yin, between the unformed and the formed, things need to come in, be digested, transmuted, transformed, and then they're useful. But if things just keep coming at us without this ability to integrate or digest, then that's a good maybe point to slow down a little bit and say, okay, well, I need to actually work on my digestion, whether that's the ability to receive or to maybe process information that's coming at you, or what you need to do in your business. It's wonderful if you can recognize that if you're trying to take on too much or receive too much, or that it's not being utilized, because that's another thing that slows us down.
Yeah.
So that's just good to keep in mind. What are you trying to digest, and how is that going?
Yeah.
And what would you say, because this comes up a lot for people, some of the practical things, what's dropping into your body is always good. But if people are having a hard time receiving money, compliments, help, where's a good place that you, for instance, would like to start making those shifts?
Yeah. I think it depends on each situation, but often in receiving, there's a giver and a receiver. And so I found that it's actually helpful to think of myself from the perspective of the giver. Something that producer Andre and I have worked on a lot is he makes these beautiful meals. He's an amazing chef, amazing cook. And I remember early on in our relationship, he would present these beautiful meals and I would be so, so grateful. And, he's very happy to give, and I'm very happy to receive in that sort of dynamic. But as soon as I would say, thank you so much for this meal, it was, so amazing and so thoughtful, and, all the things that you say to a chef who has spent all afternoon preparing a meal. And it would make him so uncomfortable and so cringy. And he would almost sort of pull back and be like, oh, it was not a big deal, or sort of diminish his effort, which then made me feel like my compliment wasn't received, And so I go back to that of if somebody's trying to give me a compliment and I'm sort of diminishing that experience, by the way, we've done a lot of work around that, and, he's kind of cheeky about it now, But, I sort of go back to those experiences, because it's if somebody's trying to give me a compliment and I'm diminishing that compliment, then how does it feel and land for that person who is telling me out of the authenticity of their heart how much, whatever it is that I did for them meant to them? Or when it comes to money, even, if somebody is investing in a offer of mine that is several $1,000s, and I didn't accept that money because it's an investment on their side and, comes with a lot of thought and care and consideration, and maybe even some adjustments in their life. Like, if I were to not think of that and receive it with the gratitude that it is being given to me in, then that shifts the dynamic between me and my client, right? And so I think it is helpful to sort of frame it not just from your own experience, but to frame it from the experience of the giver as well.
Yeah, I love that. And that's a really interesting balance too, because a lot of the lessons we need to learn through Earth is about balancing, coming back and framing things from your own perspective. But that's, always the balance and the counterpart. I think that's wonderful. And yeah, something that I've thought of too, when I have trouble receiving something, I try to think like, do I really want to block the flow of generosity? I mean, something we talk about in this medicine a lot is flowing of things and letting things run their natural courses. And where we land into trouble is whenever we come up with, we impede that natural flow of things. And when you think of someone doing something for you, who am I to stand in the way of a generous offer or a showing of kindness or a thoughtfulness? And so I try to remember, that's a great place to think of actually the other perspective. If you sort of start to scramble into trying to squash that, your worthiness, I think is part of actually why it comes down to that too, which is another Earth teaching, your own worthiness. Yes, worthy to receive, and without, and I think a lot of us get conscious about not wanting to be an overdrawer. I think we worry that we're going to leech, to draw, especially if you are a fairly energetic person. We're sensitive to these things. It's like, oh, lest I be so powerful that I vacuum you, and your reason, we want to pull our weight. We want to make sure things are fair. But part of how you make sure things are fair is that you don't constantly interrupt the abundance and resources that come to nourish you, so that you can in turn be full and generous and give from that place. So that's a wonderful little lesson.
Yeah. I also think that with the earth element, there is this idea of abundance and of things coming to fruition. And, oftentimes in the West, we think about harvest time being about the fall season, but really harvest time for most fruits and vegetables happens in the late summer. It's when tomatoes are just dripping off the vine and like peaches are the juiciest. And, that's really what I think of as being the time of abundance. Like the harvest in the fall is the grains, because as the grains are dying for their next cycle, then that you're able to harvest the grains off of the grasses. But this concept of abundance and coming to fruition, and I think it applies to not just work. Certainly, like, we got to celebrate all of that in this, the last couple weeks of BAM. But it's also about how you embody life. And to me, when I think back on my own entrepreneurial journey, and I've made a really conscious and mindful choice to really talk about the fact that, Empowered Curiosity is only 2 years old, but I've been running businesses since 2008. And I think it's important to say that, because people, like you were saying earlier, look at the tip of the iceberg and they're like, oh, Empowered Curiosity, like, you're doing quite well for yourself in 2 years. But what you don't see is underneath the surface of the work that's been happening in the entrepreneurial space for me since 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And it's now that I'm coming into this like abundance and coming into fruition with my work. But I think for me, because there was so much struggle in those first couple of years, that's why I want to teach business in the ways that I want to teach it, because I want to have people not struggle in the ways that I did for like over a decade. You know, I struggled so much with entrepreneurship that I sold my acupuncture business and then joined a busy practice up in Vancouver, which is where I met you. But it wasn't coming from a very integrated place of like, oh, I want to join this practice. Like, yes, I want to join the practice, but like a lot of it was around, I don't have to market. I don't have to advertise. I don't have to do all these things that I associated with entrepreneurship and that I had burnt myself out on because I had sort of embodied that perspective of wood element energy of like grow all the time and get bigger. And I just, at a certain point, I got really overwhelmed and was just like, I need an out. And so I think that when we talk about abundance and things coming to fruition, I think it's important to recognize that where you might see somebody else in the world in their entrepreneurial journey, whether it's me or somebody else, you aren't seeing the whole picture. And to recognize that you're not seeing the whole picture and to not compare yourself to other people, because you don't know what their journey has been like up until now. And my journey has been long. And so I don't say that to like scare people away from entrepreneurship. If anything, I want to like invite you into this circle because it's been such a healing and learning practice for me personally. But I also don't want to give off this false illusion that you can just like jumpstart something and have that be super sustainable and have it be super energetically aligned within like 6 months of starting,
Yeah. And that's where I think the self judgment and harshness comes in, that does diminish your center. Is we see that, we know that gets shown a lot. Things are starting to change where, it became more on a little more of a trend to show processes of things, but that's relatively new in documenting and showing those in their form. But still, there's still this, many years of conditions to just see the final product and not see the many seasons that went in before that. And it doesn't mean that, oh gosh, I don't want to start doing my own business because it's going to take me so long. It's like, it doesn't mean that you don't have ways to resource yourself through those processes.
Right.
But in learning that, like the more you can look at that journey and just be in whatever phase that you are and work with it and integrate it, like it leads to the next and it leads to the next. And there's this nice, sustainable, natural growth pattern instead of trying to like skip steps and jump around and or drop into fear. But I'm glad you bring that up, because I think that's one way that people really get down on themselves, is thinking, oh, I should be further ahead. Oh, I should be further along. Or, that person looks like they did that, no problem. Why isn't that working for me? Where it's just like, come back to yourself. What do you need? And where are you at? And we don't have a lot of tools around recognizing, what phase am I in?
Yeah.
And there's help for you there.
And I think that that's where like mentorship and community is so, so valuable. Is I'll sometimes sit in sessions with my clients and ask the questions that I needed asked of me when I was feeling those things, and as they're sort of processing through that question and they're sort of realigning with their own values through those questions, what I see on my side is months, if not years, being shaved off of the journey. Because, if I think about how long it took me to raise my prices in my acupuncture business, I started out at a certain rate, and there was clearly a point at which I needed to raise my prices. And I struggled with that for 6 months before I actually made the decision to raise my prices. And I think had someone been there to ask me sort of those clarifying questions and to hold space for me and to really acknowledge that, this actually isn't about the price at all, but like there are some deeper roots to this, then that would have shaved 6 months off of my journey,
Yeah.
And so I think that that's where that mentorship and community is so, so valuable, is when you have people who are in similar spaces as you and can understand what you're going through. It makes that journey so much faster. And also because we're herd animals and we, crave co-regulation, it helps us move through that journey, not just faster, but also in a more well-regulated state.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way to tie into the receiving help in those kind of ways too. Like, get yourself out of your head and into the body, into a community, into the reality, in whatever shape that looks, that feels good for you. But like, to just spin alone in your head is not great for a sustained period of time. And earth is such a great element. One of the things, each element sits in position to another, and they kind of nourish other elements, and they control others from getting, too crazy or abundant, or, there's always this balancing game. We need them all, and we need them to keep moving and harmonizing each other.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the earth element does is that it sits in a way to contain and keep in check the water element. Whereas if you think of, flooding that happens, like, we need the banks of the shore to be strong and not erode away. And you don't want water to just flood everything. And water, when we talk about it in winter, one of its emotional associations is fear. And so this is a wonderful element to tap into if you're starting to feel fear in things, fear of standing in your power, fear of asking for help because you're overdrawing, fear of not being enough unless you're doing something or giving something, fear in those transitional times where something's new and unknown. Tapping into the earth element is a wealth of resources, of practical things, and receiving help and not being alone and receiving nourishment, getting back to those things that sustain you. These are the things that actually help corral the fear and anxiety that can get a little too out of control and not so helpful if we don't have enough earth element in balance to help us. So this is, I think that's one of the wonderful energies that I love tapping into. You're going through different phases that are very appropriate for late summer. We're about to move house, which is, still not too far, but it's a very transitional thing. I'm changing, where I shelter myself, and it's going to be a transition of where we're living to another phase of our lives. And so I found myself really grateful having learned these things, because I keep tapping back into the earth energy, which feels very grounding in a period of change and transition. So it's wonderful for that. Yeah.
And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because with the elements, nothing exists in isolation. They're always in concert, in a dance with all the other elements. And you're right, like, and imagine all the fears that come up in an entrepreneurship. And I know that so many times when I've had fears come up in my own business, and I've called you up and been like, okay, this is going to sound like a totally irrational fear, but this is what I'm going through. And just having somebody to say, I hear you and I understand you. Which is like you being able to embody earth for me in that moment.
And vice versa.
You know, like,
get yourself a friend who will not judge you and be like, let me tell you this thing that I'm doing that I know is kind of crazy, but I want you to hear me. I want to hear it out loud, and then we can move through it. And it's so wonderful. So whether that's a friend or a mentor or a coach or whatever, it's great to have that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, to me, like, that's the value of the earth element, is the love and the groundedness and the care and the I've got you sort of energy that comes through when you're in the midst of like, oh my God, am I going to make rent this month? Or am I going to be able to make payroll? Or like, what is this, you know, what does this next phase mean to me? And just having somebody who can help ground you in those fears is just amazing, and something that I'm super grateful for, that I get to do that with you.
Vice versa.
Yeah,
absolutely. Oh, I love that. I don't know that we need to say any more. I think that's just so beautiful. There's one other thing that comes to mind. We can chop it out, or listener, you can ignore it if it's not useful. But the other part of the earth element, they also have sounds that they're related to. And the sound related to the earth is singing. And when you mentioned elements being in relationship to each other, we just finished summer, which is the organ of the heart and the desires of the heart. And I love the idea of not only getting grounded, like you said, with that nourishment and that friendship and that physical taking care of our needs and getting back to practical. This is also another way as entrepreneurs we ground. I would kind of almost call it, it's like the song of the heart coming through, like how what is your kind of your voice, your song that you want to sing, and having it come through, you know, in very, what is that going to look like when it comes from the yang and comes and takes that physical form? Your business, your relationships, what you have to offer the world is going to be so much more nourishing to you and those around you when it's coming from you, this personal sort of song of the heart that gets to come into the world. So that's just something else that I really liked about the earth element.
Yeah. I don't know that there's anything that I want to say to add on to that. I think that was such a beautiful way to transition us into closing.
Yeah. The only thing I want to say is thank you, Kat.
Aw, thank you.
Thank you, friend.
Yeah. And thank you, audience. And I just want to put this out there as a invitation to reciprocity, is if you are moved by these conversations that we're having on this podcast, if they've been valuable for you, then a really wonderful way that you can say thank you back is to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you leave us a rating or a review, it allows for more people who are just like you to find us and to continue to grow this community and continue to spread this work around regenerative businesses and spiritual entrepreneurship, and how we're not just weirdos who, you know, want to align with purpose and nature and cycles in our work. And I think that there's a lot more folks out there who would benefit from this conversation, and it would be so helpful if you jumped on Apple Podcasts and left us a rating and or a review. So just putting that out there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Cheech.
Thank you.